classmates, William Rowell here. This presentation is to overview my Module 1 to 3 work, to give you a bit of a better in-depth sense of the reasons why I constructed things the way that I did, with a bit of commentary about how to read over my work and some of my extra thoughts I have on what I presented to you. The Module 1 work is comprised on my website under this write-up that I did about some of the history of the different conceptions and my viewpoints on the changes of conceptions. I don't think I'll talk about it too much here, but a lot of thoughts I offered there that I'd be curious to get some feedback on in the future. What I really want to focus on are my more visual guides to the information that we've been dealing with. So I've created this Mind Moto presentation that summarizes and organizes my thoughts and the information that we've been studying about some of these different conceptions, philosophies, and pedagogies. I want to start in the upper portion of our screen here, where I have our three main categories that we've explored. And in this section, this is partly created to organize my own thoughts so that I could refer to things while I was doing some other work to make sure my thoughts were organized, but also as a way of visually representing these different paradigms in education that we're studying. So, in the conceptions of curriculum are broken into focus on society, technology, the individual, and academia, where I have summarized and referenced the different theorists that we've read about who refer to these different curriculum focuses. And I've just provided a brief link to the names that are involved here so that me and whoever else might want to use this, if they so choose, could know who to look at if they want to dive back into recapping or enriching their understanding of a particular conception. Then I organized the categories of educational philosophy: idealism, realism, reconstructionism, and pragmatism, focusing on an analysis of them on their core goals, the role of the teacher within this philosophy, and what the philosophy uses to accomplish its learning targets and goals. And I've organized a similar structure for each category to kind of summarize and condense my research on the topics. And finally, over here, we have the categories of curriculum design that we've been focusing on: the subject matter designs, society, culture-based designs, and learner-based designs. And I just shared a few thoughts of mine that I gathered from some of the readings that we did of the main approaches to each of these designs, the kind of the sub-approaches to each design, a way of kind of getting a holistic sense of what's all involved in the inner workings of each different paradigm. One of our tasks was to show the connections between these different conceptions and philosophies and design strategies. Many of you did all three of them in one table altogether, which I thought was a great idea, and in some later work I've also tried to do my own version of the same thing. But in my early work I was kind of wrestling with the interconnectivity of some of these things, and so I decided to split it up into three separate two-way comparisons. Over to the side here I have the relationships between the conceptions and the philosophical foundations. You can see that I have conceptions and the foundations listed one on each side, and I show the links between them with, in this blue box in between, my justification for why I believe they're linked together. So for example, reconstructionism is connected to a curriculum focused on society because they both share an emphasis on preparing students to be movers and shakers in their wider contexts, or society itself. And I've justified, with an example, each of the connections that I've shown here. And I think there's a lot of complexity going on in the interworkings of these different comparisons. Then a similar thing for the relationships between the conceptions and curricular designs, showing the links between there. In this case, I thought the connections were a little bit more straightforward, with subject matter design connecting both the technology and academia. Again, I've justified my reasons in between that I'll let you explore a little bit more on your own if you're curious to see my thinking behind the connections. And finally, the philosophies and curricular designs, the connections between them. Subject matter design being realism and idealism connecting in here. Learner-based designs being based on pragmatism, which also has an element of the society culture-based designs because of the emphasis on considering the social context of learning. And then reconstructionism, which is clearly connected to social cultural-based design. Again, my justifications are linked in between there. I'm going to jump over to my final piece of work for this module, And I'm going to jump over the busyness of the screen for now down to the bottom, where I provided a final summary of the connections between pedagogy and philosophy. All three of those categories I tried to condense into a simple visual guide where vertically you can see the connections between things with there being some overlap from categories in different ways. This is kind of my own mental model of how these things interrelate to one another in the simplest way I can think of. The main goal of this document, however, was to explore the application of these different paradigms: academic rationalism, self-actualization, and society culture, the kind of the ways that we summarize the three main paradigms that education is taking in its approaches of pedagogy. And I've structured this to examine planning, instruction, and down below here, assessment, focusing on central core questions or topics in each of these areas. So for example, in planning, curricular materials and learning targets are developed in advance of instruction. How important is this in each of these three paradigms? In green, I plot out academic rationalism. So for preparing materials and learning targets in advance of instruction, I determined on my continuum that academic rationalism, it is very important to paramount that this is done within that pedagogical approach. However, in the self-actualization approach, it can be situationally important, specifically if you've already identified in the past what students might be wanting to explore, or they've expressed that very clearly, and you can prepare materials in advance of future lessons to be more prepared and structured in your approach to that. But there may also be educators working in this paradigm who like to be much more reactionary and kind of work in the moment with the students to make sure it's as honest and true to who those students are as individuals, in which case developing the materials and maybe even learning targets in certain cases in advance may be relatively unimportant compared to other goals that are being sought after. And then in the society culture paradigm, I thought that there's a huge range of potential options that educators could approach this within this paradigm. Based on what I read and what I've seen in educators using this type of pedagogy, it can be really useful to be prepared if you want students to be studying a particular social issue or becoming educated about a certain strategy or approach. But it also needs to be reactionary and willing to adapt to the innately challenging and I guess changeable circumstances of students working in communities with one another. There's a lot that needs to be situationally thought through and developed on the fly or in reaction to who those students are and what their contexts are showing. On the right hand side, I've tried my best to provide either a quote or my own argument as to why I've defined each of these three paradigms the way that I did. For our academic rationalism, I justified my ranking by saying curriculum is heavily predetermined, primarily because it is based on the great conversation of civilized thought that has been gathered and passed down throughout history. In terms of why I placed self-actualization so far on the opposite end of the spectrum, I borrow a quote from Rowell, who says, "Teachers prepare in advance, but the idea of predetermined objectives, either explicitly or implicitly stated, is rejected, and the purposes of the student or a group of students are used to direct the learning processes." I think this backs up the place where I plotted out this paradigm on my spectrum. And finally, for the sociocultural, depending on the context of the learning happening, curriculum may be heavily pre-planned, like a case study of an international issue, or developed in response to context, a community development program. It kind of spans the spectrum in many ways there. I won't be going through every single topic in this presentation here, but I thought I would explain the way that I've structured this in hopefully a clear manner, and you are now free to open up my document and explore, and I hope critically think about the ways that I've analyzed where each of these three pedagogies fit on this spectrum, and also look at with a critical eye at my justifications and reasons. I am particularly curious if there is disagreement about the place that I plotted each of these three things, or the reasons I used to justify it, I by no means have mastered all these ideas, and there's a lot more room for growth I know that I have in understanding these things. But I wanted to challenge myself to clearly define my current thoughts about how each of them work, so that I could, learn and grow through the mistakes that I make, and feedback is an essential part of that. So if you have a chance to look through my work a little bit and you spot something that you disagree with, I would please urge you to, in your comments on my website,